The Minnesota Vikings are still undefeated. The New York Jets and Minnesota Vikings faced off in the first London game of the season in what was honestly a pretty ugly, gritty game all around. The Jets were looking for redemption after what was a disaster of a game against the Denver Broncos the week before, and Minnesota was fighting to retain the undefeated title. And well, they did just that. Minnesota jumped out to an early lead, scoring first on a 54-yard Will Reichard field goal. The Vikings ended up scoring again later in the first quarter on an Andrew Van Ginkel 63-yard pick six, and that really set the tone for the rest of the game. The Vikings and Jets then exchanged touchdowns in the second quarter. CJ Ham had a 2-yard touchdown run following a 74-yard drive, and right before the half, Allen Lazard caught a much-needed 14-yard touchdown pass from Rodgers to cut the deficit to just 2 scores. Now, the Vikings really hadn't been too impressive in the first half, but were still controlling the game, but that really seemed to change a bit after the half. Aaron Jones was ruled out of the game due to a hip injury, and that really felt like it stalled the Vikings offense coming out of the half. Not only that, but the Jets defense really stepped up. Minnesota would not score another touchdown for the rest of the game, and the Jets would cut the lead down to 3 points with about 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter. But it just wasn't enough. The Vikings drove down and hit a much needed 41-yard field goal to extend the lead to 23-17. The Jets had one final chance, and it all ended with an Aaron Rodgers interception to seal the game. Something that seemed to happen a lot. Rodgers really didn't play well at all. He went 29 of 54 for 244 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. He was clearly a liability in this game, and frankly, it's really concerning following Week 4's performance against the Broncos. He simply just isn't playing like how we all thought he would, and maybe it's the age or the time difference in London, but regardless, it's clear that he's missed a step this season so far. Now, this is Aaron Rodgers we're talking about, so there is still a shot that he could bounce back because, that's what he does, but the concerns really keep growing from week to week. As for the Vikings, Sam Darnold has been playing out of his mind this season and even putting his name into the MVP race, but that was not the case today. This really was not a good day for the quarterbacks. Darnold ended the day 14 of 31 for just 179 yards and an interception. I really don't know if this game was a sign of what's to come for Darnold, but I don't think I'm quite ready to hop off the hype train yet. This game certainly doesn't help his MVP campaign, but there's still plenty of season left to play. And at the end of the day, the Vikings still got the W, and that's really all that matters. They're now 5-0 and one of only 2 undefeated teams as of recording this, alongside the 4-0 Kansas City Chiefs. I still believe in Minnesota, and as for New York, well, not so much. The Vikings have definitely been a surprise early this season. Losing Kirk Cousins obviously left a big question mark there at quarterback, so drafting JJ McCarthy was definitely a sign that they were heading in the direction of a retool. But now there's the wonder of whether or not the Vikings already have a franchise quarterback, Sam Darnold. Through the first quarter of the season, he's a guy who was one of the most valuable players in the league. It was a true shock for him to get the Vikings off to a quick 4-0 start, and it's not like the Vikings had an easy schedule either. Sure, week 1 was a bit of a cakewalk with the Giants. It was a pretty easy 28-6 victory, and we all know that the Giants aren't exactly good, but the Vikings' other wins have been extremely impressive. Not many people, especially not me, thought that the Vikings would be able to beat the 49ers in week 2. Even with some big injuries and no Christian McCaffrey, the Niners are still a very good team, and the Vikings won that battle. It was a defensive game, and both teams only had a single touchdown each. The Vikings was an insane 97-yard touchdown to Justin Jefferson. That's one of those long plays that we'll see on highlight reels for years. There were really just a lot of field goals, and it really does help that the Vikings have one of the best young kickers in Will Reichard, who Minnesota just took in the 6th round. He's literally the all-time FPS scoring leader and already looks really good in the pros. The Vikings ended up winning that game 23-17, which was definitely a surprise, but the real shock came the next week when the Vikings just absolutely clobbered the Texans and CJ Stroud. It was ugly, 34-7. The Vikings defense played lights out, and Darnold played incredible, tossing 4 touchdowns without a single pick. The 49ers win was really nice, but blowing out the Texans really put people on notice. Then last week, Minnesota pulled out a tough, gritty win over the Packers. Jordan Love was returning from injury and ended up throwing 3 interceptions, but also threw 4 touchdowns. All the while, Darnold had 3 touchdowns and a single interception. It was a heck of a duel, and the Vikings Vikings really did try to blow it. Minnesota should have beaten the crap out of them. They led 28-0 in the second quarter and barely did anything for the rest of the game. The Vikes did end up winning 31-29, but it really should have been by a lot more. But that Vikings team that we saw in the first half is as good as anyone in the league. If Darnold can continue to play at a high level, the Vikings are going to be a hard team to beat all year long. Coming into the London game, Darnold had already thrown for 932 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. He really was on a roll, and it always helps to have one of the best wide receivers in football like Justin Jefferson, who had 358 yards and 4 touchdowns coming in. We all expected Jay Jettis to dominate as always, but along with Darnold, a big newcomer has been Aaron Jones. He was a heck of a player for the Packers for a while, and it's still really weird seeing him in that Vikings uniform, but he's just been dominating, and he's a big-time playmaker in the run and pass game. He already had almost 500 scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns before Sunday. Above all else, the Vikings have been a fun team to watch, which definitely wasn't expected coming into this year. Everyone expected to be watching Justin Jefferson catching passes from J.J. McCarthy by mid-season, and instead, we're wondering if Sam Darnold can keep his name in the MVP conversation and get an extension in the offseason. The Vikings have a really good chance to win the NFC North this year, and nobody expected that. The Vikings are way better than expected, but meanwhile, the Jets are the complete opposite. There were such high expectations for the Jets coming into this season again, and it's safe to say that they haven't exactly met them early on. Last year, the Jets were obviously supposed to be really good after trading for Aaron Rodgers. Everyone was so excited to see Rodgers play alongside this stacked Jets roster, and then he tore his Achilles. So we waited another offseason to see him, and the time has finally come, only for it to be a pretty underwhelming start. The Jets were finally expected to have this well put together team after getting a good quarterback, but it really hasn't been anything crazy. The Jets lost on Monday Night Football to start the season 32-19 to the 49ers, but the 49ers are still a good team, regardless of even if they lost a few games that they probably shouldn't have. But the Jets did bounce back with a couple of good wins against not really great teams. They beat the Titans in week 2 in what was another just disaster of a Will Levis game that the Titans really did have a chance to win. And then they went out and absolutely beat the hell out of the Patriots on Thursday Night Football, and suddenly the Jets were 2-1 and had a winning record. But the good times wouldn't last very long. Definitely the worst loss of the year for the Jets was in week 4. The Broncos aren't particularly good, and the Jets went out there and played terrible at home. The Jets defense was fine. I mean, they only gave up 10 points to Bo Nix, who's a rookie, but the offense just couldn't do anything. To only score 9 points when you literally have Aaron Rodgers and some supposedly elite pieces is really unacceptable, and it led to a really bad loss, one that the Jets needed to bounce back from ASAP. As a whole, there was really just a lot more expected from this Jets team this season. Rodgers really hasn't been playing that well this season. Coming into the Vikings game, he'd only passed for 5 touchdowns with an interception and 849 yards. I mean, it's a bit less than you would have expected. And it's not like Garrett Wilson has turned into this otherworldly receiver thanks to Rodgers either. He had less than 200 yards and only 1 touchdown through 4 games. A lot of people took him high in fantasy just based off of what he could become with Rodgers. But of course, it's been Rodgers' boy Allen Lazard with over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns early in the season. Breece Hall has been good in the pass and run game, but not to the same ceiling that we thought he could be. There are only going to be more questions for the Jets as the year goes on, especially if they keep losing. The roster is good, but Rodgers is getting old, and it could definitely be his final season. At this point, you really have to wonder if Robert Saleh is going to get canned and the Jets just start back over. It's hard to say, but the Jets don't really feel very likely to win the AFC East. Again, it's looking like it's going to be the Bills, even though a lot of people thought that could finally change this year. And it turns out that's not the case. It's just been disappointing. Jets fans had these massive expectations, and they just haven't been met. All the while, Vikings fans really didn't expect anything and got off to a hot start with a guy who isn't a multiple-time MVP winner.